because punishing class enemies is the point, the farmers' protests continue. Now, this is a fantastic clip of Jeremy Clarkson having an exchange with, again, BBC apologist Victoria Derbyshire. I'm just going to let this play.
So why are you here, Mr. Clarkson?
Well, because I'm here to support farmers.
Right. Are you angry?
It's difficult to be angry on somebody else's behalf. That's like being... Yes, no, I'm not angry on someone else's behalf.
Right. So it's not about you. It's not about your farm and the fact that you bought a farm to avoid inheritance tax.
Classic BBC there. Classic.
Is it?
Oh, yeah. It's not the fact that I bought a farm to avoid inheritance tax. The fact.
You told the Sunday Times in 2021 that's why you bought it.
These people.
Sorry?
BBC. Okay, let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
I wanted a shoot. Okay? That's even worse to the BBC. I wanted a shoot, which comes with the benefit of not having to pay inheritance tax. Now I do. But people like me will simply put it in a trust. And so long as I live for 7 years, that's fine. And as my daughter said, you will live for 7 years. You might be in a deep freeze at the end of it, but you will live for 7 years. But it's incredibly time-consuming to have to do that. And why should all these people have to do that? Why should they?
So one of the reasons Rachel Reeves says she brought this in is to stop wealthy people using it as a way.
No, that was the only reason she did.
Well, no, the other reason was to raise money for public services. Well, have you seen...
Are you listening to this?
Have you tried to get a GP appointment lately?
Yes,
Right.
I just recently had a heart attack.
Okay, so you know it's tough.
Yes.
So where should they get the money from if it's not from farmers?
From farmers.
You
hear that, everyone?
With
BBC
assets.
thinks you should be paying for everything.
Mr. Clarkson,
Okay,
you
do
know
you
it's
know
not the
how many
BBC
people
speak.
pay inheritance tax in this country?
It's 4% of estates.
What?
4% of estates.
4% pay inheritance tax. 96% of the population of the UK does not pay inheritance tax.
Sure.
After this becomes law, 96% of farmers will.
Where have you got that figure from?
Who here, can I just ask, who here is going to be unaffected by these changes? No one.
Right. And where have you got
I
the
know.
96% figure
Well,
from?
you've got 96%. Well, the same place that Rachel Reeves does, from the middle of her head.
Right.
From the Sixth Form Debating Society that she was no doubt a member of.
Okay.
Which
So-
formed her opinions and yours.
I am not expressing opinions. I'm
You're sure?
literally asking you questions. You know that, Mr. Clarkson.
Right.
So, what is your message to this government?
Please back down, please.
And get the money from where?
Well, they've got 40 billion. I'll tell you where you get the... Walk into any of the offices around here. If you don't understand what somebody's job is, fire them.
And how
The civil
far-
service... Civil service is too top, you know that.
How
I must get on.
I mean, this is a perfect handling of state. Mouthpieces there, Victoria Derbyshire, frankly embarrassing. And the idea that she was acting purely as a neutral observer and just asking questions rather than an apologist on behalf of the self-professed socialist Labour government, bollocks, nobody's buying it. What I found quite interesting, though, is when I put this clip out, and it did quite well and did the rounds, a Labour MP replied to me, Jonathan Brash MP, quote, "Man who claims to be fighting for other people's livelihoods demands that other people's livelihoods be ended." So the Labour Party sincerely see the resentful activists in the civil service who are basically vampires on the public purse who do nothing. Actually, they do worse than nothing. They let millions of foreign criminals in over the last how many years. They have tried to gaslight the public anytime there's a Islamic terror attack. They, over at Raiku, recently released a report, or had it leaked, that said the grooming gangs, well documented, hundreds of prosecutions, thousands of victims, is a right-wing grievance narrative, and it's concocted in a myth. Those people are more productive than the people that grow your food. That is the mentality on the Labour benches. Basically, the members of our party that agree with our ideology are our political friends, and they deserve all the money in the world. The Carr and harem syndrome that a former Soviet insider had explained to Robert Conquest about. But the farmers who are independent of state interference and usually don't vote Labour conveniently because they're self-sufficient, hard-working, patriotic people who don't want a Marxist revolution and aren't gay race communists, they can be punished. We're going to take their money, even if it makes no financial sense, because it's only going to fund one day of the NHS. But the civil service has ballooned in cost. under successive Tory and Labour governments. It doesn't make sense. It's not meant to make sense. The purpose of the system is what it does, which is punish its class enemies by taking their land, their wealth, and disrupting the intergenerational chain that are custodians of the English countryside, presumably to build infinite migrant battery farms on it, as Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner has already promised with Operation Scatter. Also, something interesting, Andrew Lloyd Webber, unexpected patron of the farmers' protest, good man, he came down and made the following assertion. The farms will all be bought by foreigners, outsiders. Many people are hovering around, rubbing their hands in glee, and I can assure you they're not British. Well, who could he possibly be referring to? Possibly Larry Fink of BlackRock, who went to 10 Downing Street. He also went and met Jeremy Hunt just before the general election. One of the BlackRock portfolio asset managers who used to work for George Osborne, who I believe George Osborne also went to work for BlackRock for a short amount of time. He went and became Jeremy Hunt's financial advisor after Jeremy Hunt became Chancellor, after the Bank of England cooed out Liz Truss and her Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng for wanting to do a minor tax cut, which included, I think, inheritance tax and stamp duty, so made it easier for people to buy and own property, which is interesting and convenient. Things that the Labour government are currently getting rid of. By the way, so I'm currently in the process of getting a house because, I don't spend money on anything except the insane deposit that I had to put down. I'm not going to tell you where, so you can't show up at my door and bother me. But as of April, the stamp duty is changing for first-time buyers, so the threshold is going massively down. So at the moment, I've only got to pay a couple of £100, let's say. Let's keep it vague, in stamp duty. As of April, and this is after some creative accounting, as of April, if I go and try and pay the stamp duty on the same property, it's going to be like £13,000. Yeah. Which I don't have. So that would stop me from buying a property for at least another year. So the purpose of the system is what it does, which is make you wards of the state, all the while you're paying social housing for the Somalians, the North Africans, the Middle Easterners that they perpetually import into this country to live at your expense while they're committing disproportionate amounts of crime. And this is convenient for BlackRock because BlackRock seems to be buying up a lot of private land in America. And also, so is Bill Gates, who recently went to 10 Downing Street. Keir Starmer captioned this photo, working with global partners, we can drive growth right across the UK whilst improving opportunities around the world. Keir Starmer, the man who said he prefers Davos to Westminster, so his heart and allegiances lie with the international financial class, who once said, you will own nothing and be happy. Bear that in mind. Lewis Brackpool, friend of mine and of the show, has submitted a Freedom of Information request to the government for the minute notes between Bill Gates and Keir Starmer. I believe he's going to do one for Larry Fink of BlackRock as well. Go and follow Lewis's work if you aren't already, because he's not only a good man, but doing actually really good journalistic reporting, because he's got a real knack for it. Very few people that do that these days. So he's hoping to get the minutes of the meeting and find out what they discuss. Now, I appreciate all of Lewis's work. He's unlikely to hear back, and the reason is someone else, probably less well-versed in how FOIs work, attempted to do this. Someone called Samantha Hemworth. I found this in my research. And Lewis's request is more precise, but whether or not that matters is up for dispute, because Samantha Hemworth sent an email on the 19th of October asking for the minutes of the meeting under the Freedom of Information Act, and they told her to kick rocks because this information is exempt from disclosure under sections 35 and 43 of the Act, because it involves the formulation of government policy and commercial interests. So basically, this relates to how they're going to enrich their political friends and members of their international party, and so you don't get to know about it, peasant. That's the response to her. It might be the response to Lewis, unfortunately. But I can hazard a guess as to what they discussed, because in this AP fact check here, they say, Bill Gates owns a lot of American farmland, but not the majority. Brackets yet. The billionaire tech mogul and philanthropist has quietly amassed, and friend of Jeffrey Epstein, nearly 270,000 acres of farmland across the United States, but that's still a relatively small slice of the nation's nearly 900 million total farm acres. BlackRock also does not own the majority of the country's 80 million single-family homes. US Census Bureau data shows that fewer than 20% of such properties are rentals, and the vast majority of these are owned by individual investors, not investors like BlackRock. In emails, BlackRock spokesman Christopher Beatty told the Associated Press that the firm invests primarily in retail, office buildings, hotels, and apartment complexes rather than single-family homes, but he declined to provide a breakdown. Oh, well, that's all right then. Don't notice patterns. would be terrible if you extrapolated from their behavior and ambition to continue to expand the scope of their property asset portfolio, both on behalf of BlackRock and Bill Gates, in conjunction with the states that work with them and do their bidding. You couldn't possibly do that, you conspiracy theorists. They're not the only beneficiaries as well. Turns out that we spend equivalent amounts of foreign aid for African farmers as is being confiscated, even at the upper end of the estimate, from British farmers. So this is an exclusive from The Express, from Christian Calgi, formerly of Guido Fawkes. More than 536 million is being spent overseas on 10 programs, including grants to promote low-carbon agriculture in Brazil and 16 million in Rwanda. So we're giving 500 million odd to African and South American farmers while destroying our own food security in order to get the equivalent money or less from our own farmers. Now, why are they prioritizing the third world? Well, as I went over in my discussion with Doug Stokes, this was last August, for his book Against Decolonization, because reparations to the third world in any way, shape or form are a form of decolonial theory, itself formulated by Marxists like Frantz Fanon and Jean-Paul Sartre, who said that if you kill a white man, you end up killing two things: the idea of the enslaved brown person and his actual oppressor. He notes that in January 1961, Nikita Khrushchev, who was the then Soviet premier, pledged support for, quote, wars of national liberation throughout the world. So in 1960s, this became the doctrine of third worldism practiced by Western Marxists in a sort of patronizing way. But they believed that places like Africa or South America were not yet corrupted by capitalism, and so had purer cultures. And so you could either import the entire third world into the West and change demographics, change culture, wage international revolution all at once, and third worldize the developed world to get it closer to the conditions that Marxism would arise from as man's natural state. Or you would be able to incite Marxist revolutions in those third world nations, and they did. Places like former Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, or Uganda, where they confiscated all the farmland off the white farmers. How's that working out for South Africa right now? All the horrific things happening to their farmers. I mean, Jeremy Clarkson did suggest they were ethnically cleansing the countryside by getting rid of white British farmers to put up migrant battery farms in. There is precedent for this stuff, and it was directed by international communists. Not unfair to compare it to the Soviet Union. But also, pure spite and envy drives this. And here's a great example. So, one of the global stooges, Matthew Wright, says that, does this serve farmers right? Is this just getting them reaping what they sow for voting Brexit? So again, they're just punishing class traitors. Here's a piece in The Guardian from Will Hutton. Quote, farmers have hoarded land for too long. Inheritance tax will bring new life to rural Britain. Translation, I think Carl attempted one of these. Farmers have been custodians of the land and growers of our food for too long. Land confiscation will instead put loads of third world dependence on that land. That's what's happening there. Now, this is all just pseudo-Marxist drivel, right? He says, one of the baleful dimensions of our times is the way that the conversation about what constitutes the good society is framed by the rich and their interests. Farmers are asset rich, but cash poor. So they spend lots of money on all their equipment and the maintenance of the land in order to grow our food, but actually, as seen in the first episode of Clarkson's Farm, first season, they turn over a minuscule profit every year because it's subject to the weather and regulations. It's no wonder that British farmers have such a high suicide rate when it's a thankless profession. And Jeremy Clarkson's rich enough to take the hit, but all of the people depicted in Clarkson's Farm Series 2 weren't, and he had to help them out by running a restaurant, which was then shut down. Seriously, if you haven't seen Clarkson's Farm yet, go and watch it. It's the most important TV show that's been done in the last, I don't even know when. And this is why people are clamouring for Clarkson to be Cincinnatus and put down his plough and take up the mantle of state, but as he told Carl, he's not planning on doing that anytime soon. But this is all conspiratorial, Marxist drivel. He says, a conception of the common good withers. It is instead replaced by the existential importance of private wealth, private interests, and private ownership to societal health. And he repeats the false statistic of the Treasury only going after 500 farms, and he says, ever since the National Farmers Union, historic houses, the Tory party, the right-wing media, and inevitably Elon Musk have behaved as if the move represents a new communist dictatorship. Well, it's being done by communists for communist reasons and results in communist ends. So yeah, it's communism. You communist. According to the lobby, a new age of Jacobin terror has been unleashed. Production will collapse, rural Britain will be devastated, and all for a trivial amount of money. Rarely have 500 very privileged people got so hysterical and commanded so much attention. Yeah, because the figures are wrong and it is a trivial amount of money, and you're currently wasting, blimey, 28 times that on battery farming foreign criminals every year at our expense. So, yeah, I kind of hate it. So he says, young farmers, now increasingly crowded out of the market, will get a chance to buy land. There is the prospect of a levelling off, even a fall in farm rents. New life and ideas will be brought into the rural economy as innovative, energetic farmers enter the market and production even increases. It's amazing how you can just make up fan fiction according to your resentful ideology and have it published in a national newspaper and receive absolutely no consequences for getting it wrong and ending the lives and livelihoods of people. I mean, the translation is, confiscate the land we use for growing food and sell it onto someone rich enough to buy it to fund the NHS for a single day without the lifelong experience to take care of it, and we somehow get new life? No, what you get is the communism you always wanted. And bear in mind, even though he says that these new farmers who have not got this experience, rather than the ones that have been working alongside their fathers all their lives, taking up the mantle of the farm and running it properly, they'll get a chance to be more productive. And, this sort of tactical libertarianism that Harry talks about, suddenly the free market will provide. It turns out from DEFRA, if you look into their statistics, in 2016, in England and Wales, a small number of economically large farms, 7%, produced the overwhelming number, 55%, so half, of the agricultural output. And this is using just 30% of the total farmed area. So, as per usual with the Pareto principle, an infinitely small number of people are the most productive. But anyway, going back to Hutton, he says, whether ancient Rome or feudal Europe, societies have taken the view that just because an individual got lucky and came out of the right womb, they are not entitled to inherit everything without paying some levy or tribute of their inherited wealth. Far from a death tax, it is a life tax on undeserved good luck. Right, so this isn't about any economic policy. This is about your ideological instantiation of blank slate egalitarianism, and it's an attempt to level all hierarchy. Any economic arguments after that are just window dressing for your resentment. This is why the likes of Elon Musk have said Britain is going full Stalin with this. And blatantly, other Labour Party members agree. This is John McTernan, who's an advisor to the Blair government, and this is this extraordinary exchange with Patrick Christis on GB News. You just have to hear it for yourself.
Farmer, that may or may not be right. I'm personally in favour of doing to farmers when they go on the streets, we can do to them what Margaret Thatcher did to the miners.
So just to be clear, John, you would, beat them up?
No, close them. I mean, this is an industry we could do without.
So, okay, all right, so this got weird. So you would do to farmers what Margaret Thatcher did to miners, which was, and she used very heavy-handed police tactics, followed by what? Putting them out of business.
If people are so upset that they want to go on the streets and spray slurry on them, then we don't need the small farmers.
Right. Okay, John, I'm not sure that's a particular... You were, just to clarify, you were a former Labour special advisor, possibly emphasis on the word former there. But just to go on, Ed Miller...
So he wants to abolish British farming because they are regime enemies. That is the exact language that the Soviet Union used to liquidate the Kulaks. And again, if Emily Maitlis thinks that I'm exaggerating, or Lewis Goodall thinks that the people in the Gulags have had something to say about that, okay, let's just listen to what they said. Here's Robert Conquest's Reflections on a Ravaged Century. I'll read at length. Quote, the countrywide terror against the peasantry, the kulaks, was based on the claims of ideology and of power. Ideology demanded that the independent peasantry be destroyed as an economic class. Power demanded that the products of the countryside be taken into the hands of the state. Sound familiar? Molotov later commented, quote, they say that Lenin would have carried out collectivization without so many victims, but how could it have been carried out otherwise? He added that Lenin would probably have done it even earlier, and that he was, quote, sterner than Stalin, and had often decided on, quote, extreme measures while, quote, rebuking Stalin for softness and liberalism, Lenin being the man who set up concentration camps and political correctness. So, the entire logic of Marxist-Leninism was the confiscation of land, whether you like it or not, and anyone who resisted was politically incorrect, impeding utopia, and deserved the most brutal measures of repression. Like, as McTernan believes, the police cracking skulls in the streets of the protest to ensure that the farmers have their land confiscated and are put out of a livelihood, and then we get our food from... I suppose we just starve like Mao's Great Famine. Another quote from Conquest. The necessary hatreds were inflamed towards the Kulaks. The activists who helped the GPU in the arrests and the deportations, Vasily Grossman tells us, quote, were all people who knew one another well and knew their victims, but in carrying this task, they became dazed and stupefied. They would threaten people with guns if they were under a spell, calling small children kulak bastards, screaming bloodsuckers. They had sold themselves in the idea that the so-called kulaks were pariahs, untouchables, and vermin. They would not sit down at a parasite's table. The kulak child was loathsome. The young kulak girl was lower than a louse. They looked on the so-called kulaks as cattle, swine, loathsome, repulsive. They had no souls. They stank. They all had venereal diseases. They were enemies of the people and exploited the labour of others. And there was no pity for them. They were not human beings. One had a hard time making out what they were. Vermin, evidently. Grossman, himself Jewish, and the Soviet Union's leading writer on Hitler's Holocaust, draws the analogies with the Nazis and the Jews. A woman communist explains, quote, what I said to myself at the time was, they are not human beings, they are kulaks. Who thought up this word, kulak, anyway? Was it really a term? What torture was meted out to them in order to massacre them? It was necessary to proclaim that kulaks are not human beings. Just as the Germans proclaimed that Jews are not human beings, thus did Lenin and Stalin proclaim kulaks are not human beings. The party's reply and its rationale for everything done to the kulaks is summarized with the exceptional frankness in a novel by Ilya Ehrenberg, published in Moscow in 1934. Quote, not one of them is guilty of anything, but they belonged to a class that was guilty of everything, such as the farmers who just don't want to pay inheritance tax that we could do without. In another such novel, also published in Stalin's time, a party man says he can no longer go on persecuting women and children, but the chief activist, Nagulnov, will not have it. Quote, snake, he gasped in a penetrating whisper, clenching his fist. How are you serving the revolution? Having pity on them? Yes. You could line up thousands of old men, women and children and tell me they'd got to be crushed into the dust for the sake of the revolution, and I'd shoot them all down with a machine gun. Or as another activist puts it, quote, he thinks he is killing a bullock, but in reality is stabbing the world revolution in the back. And Nagulnov's example was on the whole followed. It is to an activist of this period that the well-known saying is attributed, Moscow does not believe in tears. Former activists have written of how they kept their ideological faith right through the performance of actions against the starving villagers, of which the great Lev Kopelev, one of Russia's leading dissidents, wrote, quote, it was excruciating to see and hear all this, and even worse to take part in it, and I explained to myself, I mustn't give in to debilitating pity. We were realizing historical necessity. We were performing our revolutionary duty. We were obtaining grain for the socialist fatherland. For the 5-year plan. Our great goal was the universal triumph of communism. For the sake of that goal, everything was permissible. To lie, to steal, to destroy hundreds of thousands and even millions of people. All those who were hindering our work or could hinder it. Everyone who stood in the way. And to hesitate or doubt about all of this was to give in to intellectual squeamishness and the stupid liberalism, the attribute of people who could not see the forest through the trees. As a result, over the winter of 1932 to 1933, major famine swept the grain-growing areas. Some 4 to 5 million died in Ukraine, and another 2 to 3 million in the North Caucasus and the Lower Volga area. During this period, about 1.7 million tons of grain was exported, and after provided about a kilogram a head a day to 15 million people over 3 months. And this apart from the millions of tons held in state reserves supposedly in the case of war, many of which ended up rotting, according to Solzhenitsyn. We now have full documentation that the Stalin leadership knew exactly what was happening and used famine as a means of terror and of revenge against the peasantry. And so the next time, they accuse Churchill of causing the Bengal famine by somehow pouring a libation out to Poseidon to conjure up a cyclone which impeded the grain exports. The people that espouse that lie lionize this ideology as at least never having been tried. This is what they do. They exterminate their class enemies if you don't serve the interests of or belong to the party. They beat you, they starve you, they kill you, they imprison you, they censor you, they demonize you, they reduce you to less than vermin for being a revolutionary enemy, for getting in their way, for being a kulak, for being a British farmer. They think they can do without you. They think they can do violence to you. They think they can destroy your livelihood and your life. Do not underestimate these people. Solzhenitsyn actually described the arrival of the kulaks into the gulags. He says, and so the waves foamed and rolled of people. But over them all, in 1929 to 30, billowed and gushed the multi-million wave of dispossessed kulaks. It was immeasurably large, and it could certainly not have been housed in even the highly developed network of Soviet interrogation prisons, which in any case were packed full by the gold wave. Instead, it bypassed the prisons, going directly to the transit prisons and camps, onto prisoner transports into the Gulag country. In sheer size, this non-recurring tidal wave, it was an ocean, swelled beyond the bounds of anything the penal system of even an immense state can permit itself. There was nothing to be compared with it in all of Russian history. It was the forced resettlement of a whole people, an entire ethnic catastrophe. And how could they be indifferent? How could they take pleasure in such suffering? In Reflections on a Ravid Century, the revolutionary believed it to be in the nature of things that dictatorship and terror are needed if the good of humanity is to be served, just as the Aztec priests believed themselves to be entirely justified in ripping the hearts out of thousands of victims. Since they had not done so, if they had not done so, the sun would have gone out, a far worse catastrophe for mankind. In either case, the means are acceptable, being inevitable, that is, if the theory is correct. And so, as Gus O'Donnell articulated in David Goodhart's The Road to Somewhere, while he was cabinet minister for the Blair government, if you believe that your duty is to raise the global level of welfare, either by sending aid overseas to African farmers or importing all of Africa into Britain to raise a standard of living, yeah, sure, crushing your own domestic industries, ruining the livelihoods of your people, ruining your countryside, persecuting your politically incorrect enemies who won't accept the outcome of the revolution, calling them far right, locking them up in prison and having them kill themselves like Peter Lynch, or be subjected to abuse by the Muslim gangs that are in there, if you're not actively freeing said criminals as a client group out onto the street in their thousands every month, all of those things are acceptable. And this is what the self-professed socialists and communists leading this country are doing. They are making the UK indistinguishable from the Soviet Union. Thank you for watching that clip from Tomlinson Talks. If you liked that and you would like to see more, you can get the full 90-minute show every week on a Wednesday afternoon, live from 3 p.m, only on lotuseaters.com, and all of the other content that my colleagues produce behind the paywall for as little as £5 a month. Thank you very much for supporting us, and I hope to see you there. Until next time, goodbye.